Occasionally in my shop I have to rip a piece of wood to some level of precision, and historically I've made do with what I had. I've used my featherboard, for example, the back side of it as a thin ripping gauge, and that's worked okay, but you do get some binding up here, and it's not the greatest tool for that in the world. So I decided to make this thin ripping jig here. It is adjustable and has a high resolution ruler on it with a little marker here to keep track of where you are, and it seems to work pretty well. I decided to put a roller on this end to reduce friction, and I milled up this aluminum piece. I have a sliding dovetail to have this piece slide back and forth. The runner is made of mahogany. I'm using a toilet bolt going through the runner, and stay tuned and you'll see how I build it. And I looked around for a piece of wood that would make a good runner. I need one about this long, and I'm looking for one where the grain is running straight up and down in the direction of the runner. So if this were going to fit in the slot like so, this grain orientation is almost perfect. So this looks like a nice piece of mahogany. I'm going to plane this edge to get it smooth. Now I'm going to run it through the table saw and just kiss this edge so that this edge turns out to be parallel to this edge that I just planed smooth. Since I don't currently own a thin strip ripping jig, the technique I use is I have a spacer here that's 5/16 of an inch, a little over 1/4 inch. Put that against the blade and I line up my featherboard and I just snug it. And now I can draw this back in the miter slot, and I can put this piece of stock in here and move the fence just till it meets the featherboard. If I lock the fence down, get my featherboard out of the way, you can see if I run this over here, I'm going to end up with a piece that's about this thickness. Set up the featherboard, and while I was at it I cut a second blank. Now I'm going to clean up the burn marks on each side, and then I'm slowly going to narrow the width to hopefully get a perfect fit in the miter slot. I'm going to use my little tiny plane for control. Or Vaughan and Bushnell hand plane, the two-hand operation, gives me a little more control, helps me hold the plane square. It fits, so that was one shaving, didn't fit. One more pass with the plane did fit. And here is the shaving that came out. So that's a pretty snug fit. And it's funny, as I go to the top and bottom of my table saw, it binds, leading me to believe that the center of my miter slot is ever so slightly wider than the two edges. I think either one will work fine, and I'll put the other one in storage for a future jig. I have these thin pieces of hard maple that will make a good stock for this jig. This one is just cut square for the moment. This one I squared up the edges. I tipped my table saw here to 7 degrees so that I'll be able to use a sliding dovetail joint. So here are the main pieces, just a couple blocks of wood. That's a good snug fit in the miter slot. These two pieces are the channel, and this is the main beam. This piece doesn't have to be a sliding dovetail, but it's not difficult to make one. There will have to be a hole in this board for a screw or a bolt, and there'll be a slot in this piece so that the beam can slide in and out. Well, this is my second attempt at a sliding dovetail, and this one's looking a lot better. And this lower piece is just held in place by these two clamps. On my first attempt, I didn't get a very effective joint. This particular piece had a taper on it, and I'm not sure how it happened, but I did try to lightly sand and scrape each of these four faces, and somehow this ended up with a 50 thousandths larger on one side than the other, and that was enough for this to bind severely on one end and be sloppy loose on the other. So what I've done is I've mounted two planes in my vise to hold them. This one is here just to prevent the vise from racking, and I took some time to very carefully drag the critical edges along the plane to try to get a nice clean flat face, and it seems as though it's pretty parallel. Trying to minimize squeeze outs. I'm trying to get just enough glue, get a thin coat on the two faces. Alright, I'll let that set up. So here it is all glued up, and it works pretty well. This seems to be a pretty snug and reliable joint. I went to the local box store and I picked up this set of 4 rollers. These are the rollers that are used in a shower door, and they come with these screws on them, and the screws thread into them. They're not ball bearings, but they're pretty close to a bearing. And the threads on them, by happy coincidence, is 832, which happens to be the screw that's on the back of knobs and pulls for kitchen cabinetry, and I have a ton of those screws. So my thoughts are that I'm going to put maybe 2 of these back to back and put a screw through it and use that as the bearing. I have my homemade router plane here, and this is the mortise I'm trying to shape up. They're all mounted here. They're resting on my bench hook, and these 2 pieces are the same thickness as the piece I care about to add some stability to the router plane. And I'm just gonna Well, I didn't record it because it's usually a non-event, but I went to screw this piece in, and this screw here broke on me. And there it is, the shaft is in that hole. So now I got a problem. I got to try to get that steel out of that hole without creaming this too much. I've got way too many hours invested in this piece. So it took about 15 minutes or so, but I just dug that piece out by drilling around it and drilling carefully around it. Broke one of my drill bits, but that's okay. And eventually it was loose enough I could get some needle nose pliers in there and pull it out. Now I just got to drill it out a little more and get some sort of a wood plug in there. So I have a 1/4 inch brad point bit that fits in that hole. It's a little loose, but I think it'll be okay. And I also have this 1/4 inch plug cutter and a scrap of maple that I can hopefully cut a couple plugs out of. That'll be useful. Well, surprise, surprise, this plug cutter I bought from Harbor Freight years and years ago for emergency use. About that good. Just look at how it burned. It's cutting into maple here, but I do have a plug that looks possibly acceptable. Just to be clear, when I broke the first screw, I tried to screw it in by hand like I'm doing here. I think I had a defective screw. It's a little annoying. Okay, and there we have it, and that's a pretty solid mounting of these 2 rollers. There's a little bit of play in there, but I think that'll be okay for my application. But there you have it. I trimmed that flush, and there are the 2 rollers, and that seems to be held pretty snug, and I'm happy with that. I have to drill a slot in this piece, and I just marked it out. I think the easiest way for me to do it is to mark the end point and then score a groove the other end point. And this groove in here will help facilitate keying a brad point bit right along this line, like so. And there are the holes first drilled. Now I'm just going to use the drill to clean up the shoulders a little bit. I'm making another series of knobs. It's kind of hard to see, but I marked out the center of where each of the knobs would be. I drew a circle, and then I drew 45-degree lines off of the 90s, and I marked each of the 4 corners in the center of each circle. And now we start cutting them out. One thing I've learned the hard way is you can actually press these in a little crooked, so you want to take your time and make sure that it's lined up pretty well. And there it is done, and the way I do it, I don't like it to come all the way poking through the top, so I leave it a little shallow. And it actually looks like I got a little splitting in there. I'm going to have to get a little glue in there to fix that, but this is ready to roll. Well, I milled up a set of these knobs and I finished this one. I waxed the moving surfaces of this guy, and I'm going to put a little boiled linseed oil on the rest of it for good measure and a modicum of protection. While I'm in the process of calibrating this, I made a cut and I made a slight adjustment to the scale. Now I've got this set for 1/4 inch, and if I move the fence over till this is engaging the roller carefully, that looks good. And if I measure that 1/4 inch, 250 thousandths off by 2 1/1000ths of an inch, good enough for me if I squeeze a little tighter. So I think that's pretty good. Well, I have to admit this stupid thing was a lot harder to build than I thought it would be. Thought I'd have it done in an afternoon or so, maybe 2, but it took me probably twice that long. Part of it was hunting around for just the right materials. I thought a 1/2 inch maple would be a good candidate. The sliding dovetail here, I think, proved to be far more trouble than it was worth. If I had to build another one, these would just be straight 90-degree edges. This doesn't need to be a dovetail because it's held in place by the locking bolt. The little piece of ruler here was super glued in place. This is stainless steel, high precision. These came from the box store. These are rollers for a sliding bathroom door. A piece of aluminum here that I machined, drilled and tapped, and just a piece of plexiglass. Well, that's all I have for this one. I appreciate you stopping by. Appreciate it if you like and subscribe. Leave a comment. I love to read them. And as always, take care, be safe, and we'll catch up with you on the next one.